Preserving American Biodiversity in the Anthropocene. Currently, human impact is seen as a dominant force towards changes in the climate and the environment. Habitats have been shifting and are rapidly diminishing because of this era now being called the Anthropocene. Rather than focus on preserving the rich biodiversity that exists in the southeastern United States, the U.S. has only protected the landscapes of the western states, much of which are federally owned. Whether or not the U.S. has the available resources to achieve protection in privately owned areas is under debate. Regardless, as the range of species continues to shift, continuous intervention will become necessary. If this issue is not addressed, we will encounter an extinction of thousands of endemic species. Our initial Jenkins article stresses the issue of mismatch as landscapes are protected instead of biodiversity. The areas that need protection encompass much of the southeastern United States, where much of the land is privately owned and requires purchasing for conservation easements. The report uses data involving the geographic ranges of endemic species at risk to highlight the regions of importance. The data is used to calculate priority scores. The proportion of the range of these species that is under protection determines this score, and those with the least are shown in this diagram. The article states that the country has the economic resources to claim land and issue conservation easements in these areas. The second article agrees about the issue of conservation mismatch. However, it takes a more economically focused approach. Rather than prioritize the species at risk, Brown focuses instead on actions that can bring profitable returns. This article does not state that the U.S. has inadequate assets, yet it primarily emphasizes the limits of cost. Additionally, political, social, and economic constraints will limit conservation efforts. Jenkins responds to Brown's criticism with some critique of his own. Jenkins notes that focusing on cost and convenience will not lead to effective conservation. Instead of worrying about the obstacles of conservation, concern should be about the extinction of thousands of endemic species in unprotected biodiverse regions. This response also mentions that assuming complete authority over conservation matters in these areas would be ridiculous. While still having a realistic approach, the most effective method of conservation involves motivating local government towards proper strategies specific to the area at risk. The last article by J. Kevin Hires brings up another equally important aspect of conservation. This article emphasizes the shifting of habitats from climate change and that focusing on specific conservation targets will lead to failing efforts. Rather than focus on maintaining habitats in their current locations, a more cost-effective form of conservation will likely involve focusing on strengthening the resilience in these species, allowing them to increase their geographic range. We cannot emphasize constraints or the specific privately owned lands that need conservation. Our history of conservation policy indicates that we have wasted our resources and that our strategies must become more complex and involve constant intervention to match the changing environment. Now, after gaining an understanding of the topic, we will discuss the concept with various GIS data layers. Our main question for research is, by analyzing these layers, will we acquire information that backs up the severity of conservation mismatch? And specifically, will there be clear patterns highlighting the regions most deserving of conservation? Our first action involves the feature-to-point raster tool, in which we create a layer displaying the protected points in the contiguous United States, shown here in green. This confirms Jenkins' theory, as conservation points are lacking in the southeastern United States. However, we can determine much more than points of protection. In continuation of the model we have started to run, we then use a second raster tool involving point density. Through this calculation, we arrive at the data layer of neighborhood protection. These protection areas are also shown in green, and outside of southern Florida, southeastern protection is basically non-existent. But how important is protecting the southeast? Jenkins' priority index highlights central Texas, the west coast, but most specifically the southeast, as areas that need the most attention for the protection of endemic species. These regions are displayed in red as the opposite of green, which earlier resembled conservation hotspots. As we have seen, the private ownership in these areas has led to the lack of protection, but that must not be the only underlying process of this trend. With the data layers for mammals, birds, amphibians, and trees, we can determine the biodiversity hotspots in the United States and see how they relate to the areas indicated by Jenkins' priority index. With a raster calculator, I have created a data layer for these hotspots and with a similar color scheme, the maps show a very similar pattern. From this layer, we can see that another factor that must be considered is the vast number of species that exist in these regions. Not only are these regions highly unprotected, they are the most biodiverse, as Jenkins has alluded to. Now that we understand the underlying causes of this priority index, we can model it with the neighborhood protection and see in one picture that the areas protected, shown in purple, are not correlated with the areas stressed in Jenkins' index. This confirms that conservation has been wasteful and that efforts must shift in location, as the articles have suggested. Analyzing the data layers has confirmed the need for change in the areas that we need to focus our spending on. However, research should continue, and data will likely change as climate change continues to move the habitats of species in America. With any luck, our biodiversity hotspots may end up moving into more protected lands, but regardless, our focus should be on the survival of species in the areas highlighted in the priority index. Without continuous intervention in these regions, we will experience the drastic mass extinction that Jenkins fears.